480 Marines rolled into that valley at dawn. By 700, the valley was on fire, vehicles burning, men screaming, radio traffic so thick with panic it bled into static. An ambush so perfectly engineered that the men who planned Operation Iron Spear would spend the rest of their careers trying to explain how they missed it. They almost missed something else, too. One woman, one rifle, nearly a kilometer of open desert between her and the kill zone. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to exist in that story at all. Her name was Sergeant Maya Torres, and every single person at Forward Base, Redstone, had already decided she didn't matter. They were about to find out what that decision cost. If this kind of story hits different for you, subscribe to the channel right now and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and stale ambition. Maya Torres sat in the back row, which was where logistics personnel always sat, behind the officers, behind the senior NCOs, behind the people whose opinions had weight. The fold-out chair beneath her creaked every time she shifted. Nobody had bothered to fix it in 6 months. Nobody was going to. She kept her notebook open on her knee and her pen moving even when the briefing made her stomach tighten. Major Ethan Rourke was at the front of the room, pointer in hand, laser dot, dancing across a topographical map of Raven Pass. He had the kind of face that photographed, well-square jaw, steady eyes, the look of a man who had been told his whole career that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He spoke with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything important. Operation Iron Spear launches at 5:30 Thursday, Rourke said. 480 personnel, 22 vehicles. Primary route through Raven Pass, secondary through Route Delta if conditions deteriorate. He tapped the map twice. Intel confirms the corridor is clear. Local insurgent activity has been minimal for the last 18 days. Command considers this a controlled movement to objective. Maya's pen stopped. She looked at the map. Then she looked at it again, the way you look at a sentence that says something it shouldn't. Raven Pass was a 12-kilometer channel, cut between two ridgelines. On the western side, the elevation climbed almost 400 meters in less than half a kilometer, fractured sandstone shelves stacked like bad teeth, perfect for a concealed firing something position, looking straight down into the road. The eastern ridge was lower but longer, stretching parallel to the route for nearly 8 kilometers without a single natural break in cover. The road itself was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles side by side. There was no meaningful defilade, no secondary cover. If something went wrong inside that corridor, your options were to fight forward, fight backward, or die in place. She had studied this terrain for 11 days, not because anyone asked her to, because she couldn't stop looking at it. "Sir," she said it quietly at first. The briefing kept moving. "Sir," louder this time. Rourke paused. He looked toward the back row with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during something important. "Sergeant Torres, the 18-day quiet period in the pass," she said. "What's the source on that assessment?" The room shifted slightly. A few heads turned. Staff Sergeant Derek Cole, seated 2 rows ahead of her, didn't bother turning around. She could see the set of his shoulders, that particular stillness that meant he was already constructing something contemptuous to say. HUMINT corroborated by aerial surveillance, Rourke said. Why? What altitude was the surveillance running? A beat. That's not relevant to logistics coordination, Sergeant. The eastern ridgeline has a natural overhang at about 280 meters elevation, Maya said. Thermal imaging from above that altitude wouldn't catch anything positioned underneath it. And the western shelves, the rock formation, at the first bend, I've been looking at the satellite imagery. There's vehicle track disturbance about 40 meters off the road that isn't from any of our patrols. Cole turned around now. He had a wide face, sandy stubble. He kept just long enough to suggest he didn't care, and eyes that always seemed faintly amused by something that wasn't funny. Torres. He said her name, like it was a brand of something cheap. Are you telling the room that you found something our intelligence apparatus missed? From looking at satellite photos. I'm saying the photos show something that hasn't been explained. Your logistics support. I can read a map. You can read a map. He repeated it, flat, the way you repeat something a child says. There was quiet laughter somewhere in the row ahead of her. Rourke set the pointer down. His voice stayed level, but the patience in it had changed quality. It was the kind of patience that was really just controlled dismissal. Sergeant Torres, I appreciate that you've been engaged with the terrain assessment. But the intelligence on this corridor has been reviewed at the battalion level and above. If there were meaningful concerns about the route, they would have surfaced before now. He looked at her for one more moment. Anything else? She thought about saying more. She had the mortar positioning angles, the sightline geometry, the math of how many rifles you could hide on that western shelf and still maintain mutual support. She had done the math 3 times because she kept hoping she was wrong. No, sir, she said. Rourke nodded and turned back to his map. Cole faced forward again. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The base at Redstone sat in a wide, flat depression about 7 kilometers from the nearest high ground, surrounded by blast walls, concertina wire, and the permanent smell of diesel and dust. It had been operational for 14 months. In that time, it had developed the particular culture of a place where the hierarchy had calcified, where everyone knew their weight and stayed inside it. Maya Torres weighed almost nothing here. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and built lean from years of running terrain. She had no business running alone. She'd grown up in Tucson, the daughter of a former Army mechanic who had taught her to shoot before she could drive, and a mother who had worked 2 jobs and still found time to make sure Maya understood that the world would not make room for her. She would have to make room for herself. She had enlisted at 22 after 2 years of community college and 1 year of a management degree she abandoned when she realized she was only pursuing it because it seemed like the kind of thing she was supposed to want. The Corps had felt right in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The structure, the physical demand, the sense that competence actually had weight. She had been good at the physical side immediately. She had been good at reading terrain almost as quickly. The rifle qualification had come easily. She had always had the patience for distance, the ability to go very still inside herself and wait. But she had been assigned to logistics, supply chain management, equipment tracking, vehicle maintenance coordination. She was good at it. She was good at most things she put real attention into. It just wasn't what she had come for. She had applied twice for scout sniper training. The first time, her unit was short-staffed, and her commander denied the request on operational grounds. The second time, the denial came from a level above her commander and included language out current ops requirements that was technically accurate and completely hollow. She knew what it meant. She had been looked at, categorized, and filed. By the time Operation Iron Spear came up on the board, Maya had been at Redstone for 7 months, long enough to know every person's rank and most of their opinions, long enough to understand that in this particular ecosystem, the question was never just whether you were right. The question was whether anyone with authority believed you were worth listening to. After the briefing, she went back to her workspace, a small desk, in the logistics coordination room, wedged between a server rack and a wall covered in inventory manifests. She pulled out the satellite imagery she had printed and spread across her desk. Her finger traced the western ridgeline, the rock shelf at the first bend in the pass, the shadow beneath the overhang on the eastern side. Corporal Danny Reyes appeared in the doorway. He was 23, too young looking for his rank, with an easy smile he deployed constantly as a kind of social lubricant. He had been assigned to her section 8 months ago, and had long since stopped being surprised by what she did with her off hours. "They shut you down?" he said. Rourke wasn't interested. Cole's never interested. Reyes came into the room and looked at the map over her shoulder. He didn't pretend to understand what he was looking at the way some people did. He just looked honestly, trying to follow what she was seeing. She had always appreciated that about him. "You think it's that bad," he said. "I think if someone wanted to design the perfect place to destroy a convoy, they would draw this." She put her finger on the narrowest point of the pass. "You enter here, the ridges close in. You can't turn the vehicles around without exposing your flank for 30 seconds minimum. Machine guns from the western shelf hit you from above and to the left. RPG teams on the eastern ridge hit you from the right. You're bracketed." She looked up at him, "and then whoever's running the operation drops the road from the south with mortars, so you can't push forward or back." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "How many people are walking into that?" 480. He said nothing. "I know," she said. The convoy loaded out before dawn on Thursday. Maya stood near the motor pool and watched the vehicles stage, MRAPs and 7 tons, a pair of gun trucks, the command vehicle with its antenna cluster. The Marines moved with the contained, focused energy of people who had done this enough times that it was almost routine. Almost. She recognized faces. Sergeant First Class Haggerty from her PT group, who had 2 kids in Pensacola and always ran with his wedding ring on a chain around his neck instead of on his hand because he was afraid of losing it. Private First Class Okafor, who was 19 and had told her once, in a rare moment of stripped-down honesty, that he had joined because his older brother had, and he couldn't think of anything else that felt real. Lieutenant Dalloway, who she barely knew but who had nodded at her in the chow hall last week in a way that felt like the beginning of an actual human acknowledgement. 480 people. She had her rifle on her back. She hadn't planned that it was muscle memory the same way she always carried it during operations. But she found herself standing there, watching the last vehicles roll toward the gate, and something in her chest went very cold and very still. Major Rourke passed her on his way to the command post. He glanced at her. "Get back inside the wire, Torres," he said. "You're on inventory audit today." "Yes, sir," she said. She watched him walk away. The convoy disappeared through the gate in a column of dust and diesel smoke. Maya stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward the logistics room, the way she was supposed to. She made it about 40 meters. She did not tell herself a story about heroism. She was not the type. She thought about consequences, the UCMJ, the charges, the career she had been building peace by grudging peace in a place that didn't want her to build it. She thought about Rourke's face in that briefing room, the calm certainty, the total absence of doubt. She thought about how it would look. Logistics sergeant, no combat record, goes rogue on her own read of satellite photos. She thought about Okafor, 19 years old. His brother had joined first. She turned around. She moved fast, because fast was the only way to make the decision before the rational part of her brain could catch up and talk her out of it. Back to her hooch, grabbed the pack she had pre-staged. 3 days ago, she wasn't completely sure why she had staged it, except that some part of her had already known she might need it. Rifle, 400 rounds in stripper clips and preloaded magazines, rangefinder, water, radio. Her personal notebook with the terrain sketches she had been making for 11 days. She slipped through a gap in the perimeter near the vehicle wash station that she had identified 2 months ago during a maintenance check. It wasn't a security failure exactly. It was more a place where the geometry of 2 blast walls created a shadow that the guard rotation didn't cover for about 4 minutes out of every 30. She had noted it on a log that nobody read. The desert opened up around her like a held breath. The western ridgeline was 12 kilometers away. The convoy had a 15-minute head start. She started running. There is nothing romantic about running 12 kilometers in body armor, with a full combat load in desert heat. The ground wasn't flat, it rolled and broke, loose shale over hardpack, the occasional soft spot where the sand ran deep and swallowed your boot to the ankle. The sun was barely up, but the air already had weight to it, that dry, pressing heat that took the moisture out of your mouth after the first kilometer. Maya ran and stopped thinking. This was something she had discovered at 18 on a particularly bad cross-country race when she'd cramped up at the 6-kilometer mark and had to make the choice between stopping and herding through it. She had found a place in her head where she could separate the running from herself, let the body handle the mechanics, and keep only the bare minimum of cognition, active direction, terrain, pace. Everything else went offline. It wasn't pretty. Her form collapsed around kilometer 7. Her left knee had a tracking issue she'd been managing for 2 years, and it started talking to her at kilometer 8 in a sharp, specific way that meant she'd need ice and 3 days of reduced activity when this was over. Her lungs felt wrong, too tight, like someone had shrunk the available space. She ran anyway. At kilometer 9, she crossed a dry creek bed and angled north toward the base of the western ridgeline. The ridge rose in front of her in a series of broken shelves, sedimentary rock that had been folding and fracturing for geological eons. From the ground it looked almost random, chaotic. From above, in a satellite image, she had seen the pattern. The shelves created natural firing lanes pointing directly down into the pass. She started climbing. The ridgeline was harder than she'd expected and easier than she'd feared, which is how terrain usually worked if you'd done your homework. She had memorized the route from the imagery third shelf up to the split boulder, then left along the natural ledge to the outcropping at the first bend. From the outcropping, she would have direct sight lines down into approximately 4 kilometers of the pass. She pulled herself over the final ledge and went flat immediately, rolling into the shadow of a rock formation that was about as wide as a truck. Standard practice: don't silhouette on high ground. Move low, move slow when you reach the position. She got to the outcropping's edge and looked down into the pass. Through her rangefinder, 847 meters to the road. The first convoy vehicles were just entering the narrowest section. She could see the dust plume, the antenna of the command vehicle, the hard geometry of armored hulls, moving in column. Then she looked at the ridges, both of them. She had been right. She had been completely, precisely right, and it gave her no satisfaction at all. The eastern ridge, at least 3 heavy machine gun positions, concealed under netting that matched the rock color almost perfectly. She only caught them because she knew where to look, and the morning light was catching the edge of a barrel at the wrong angle. RPG teams in dead ground between boulders. She counted 4, maybe 5. The western shelf, below her, and to the right, a mortar crew already set up, tube elevated, gunner waiting. 2 additional positions she could see, and probably more she couldn't. And on the eastern ridge, nearly level with her position, but a kilometer and a half across the pass, a man standing slightly apart from the others. Binoculars up, radio handset close, a person giving orders. The command element. Maya got behind her rifle. She thought, I don't have authority to do this. I am going to be prosecuted for this, she thought. Okafor is 19 years old. Then the first rocket streaked out of the eastern ridge and hit the 3rd vehicle in the column, and the valley turned into the inside of a nightmare. The sound reached her a half-second after the flash, a deep, tearing concussion that rolled up the ridgeline and hit her chest like a fist. Then the machine guns opened up, all of them, simultaneously, the coordinated initiation of an ambush that had been planned by someone who knew what they were doing. The radio in her pack erupted in voices layered on top of each other, impossible to parse individually, but the collective sound was unmistakable. Panic. Organized panic was still panic. She found the first target in her optic. RPG gunner on the eastern ridge, tube up, second shot being prepared. She could see him from the chest up, moving with quick efficiency, no idea anyone was watching from the opposite ridgeline. Maya exhaled. Her world shrank to a circle of glass. Range, 612 meters to the eastern ridge. Wind, 4 knots left to right from her position. She had checked it twice on the climb. Target, stationary for the moment, braced for the shot. She had one chance to get this right before everyone on that ridge started looking for where her shot came from. She squeezed. Crack. The report was swallowed almost immediately by the noise of the ambush below, machine guns and burning vehicles, and screaming and the layered percussion of a firefight in an enclosed space. She was already moving the rifle, new target, her eye scanning the eastern ridge for the next priority. The RPG gunner had dropped. The man next to him stared at the body for 1 full second, not understanding. That second cost him. Crack, 2 down. She shifted left. The machine gun position that was tearing through the 3rd and 4th vehicles in the column. She couldn't hit the gun itself from this angle, but she could see the gunner. He was well concealed, only his head and part of one shoulder visible above the rock parapet he'd built. Small target, long shot. She had been making this shot since she was 16 years old on her father's range outside Tucson. Crack. The machine gun went quiet. For the next 20 minutes, Maya Torres conducted a one-woman war from the western ridgeline, and she did it with the methodical efficiency of a person who had thought very carefully about exactly this kind of situation, and then spent years of her life quietly developing the skill to handle it. She was not calm. That was the important thing to understand. She was not calm. And the idea that precision requires calm is mostly myth. Her hands were shaking. Her heart rate somewhere between sustainable and dangerous. Twice she took shots she wasn't fully confident in, and she knew it, felt the wobble in the trigger pull, and had to assess immediately whether she needed to fire again. Once she did, once she didn't. She moved between positions every 4 to 6 shots, crawling on her elbows across the rocky ledge, repositioning before anyone on the eastern ridge could triangulate her location from the muzzle flash. The western shelf below her was facing the wrong direction to hear her clearly over the ambient noise of the firefight. She had maybe another few minutes before one of them thought to look up. The radio traffic in her earpiece had changed. Still loud, still urgent, but there was a shape emerging in it. Squad leaders calling positions, a platoon commander acknowledging, the halting structure of men who had been hit hard and were starting to organize rather than just react. Ghost element. We have overwatch fire from the western ridge. Someone is engaging from the western ridge. Do not know call sign, do not have IFF. IFF identification, friend or foe. They didn't know who was shooting. Of course they didn't. She didn't answer. She was busy. The mortar crew on the western shelf below her had managed to get 1 round off before she found them. It had landed short of the column, which meant they were still adjusting, which meant they would get it right on the second shot. She had put 2 rounds into their position in rapid succession, not waiting for confirmation, because sometimes the tactical situation didn't give you the luxury of confirmation. The secondary gun position on the eastern ridge opened up while she was dealing with the mortar crew, and for about 40 seconds she was shooting at 2 different threats simultaneously, or as close to simultaneously as a single shooter could manage. It wasn't elegant. It was barely controlled. One of the shots she fired in that window was the worst she took all morning. She knew it. As soon as the trigger broke, felt the error, watched the round impact 2 feet left of the intended target. She reloaded. You're burning through ammo. Slow down. Pick targets, make them count. She picked the next target. Crack. The eastern ridge had started looking for her. She could see the subtle shift in how the remaining enemy fighters were moving the way. Heads were turning in her direction when there was a pause in the fighting. Someone had figured out that the casualties were coming from the wrong angle. Someone was talking into a radio. Maya found a different position, pressed herself flat against a rock shelf, and used her rangefinder to scan for the commander she had spotted at the beginning. He had moved. She scanned left, then right. There he had pulled back to a secondary position, still with the radio handset, still directing. Smarter than she'd given him credit for. He had put a ridge feature between himself and where her shots had been coming from. But he hadn't accounted for someone moving. Range, 891 meters. Wind had picked up slightly 6 knots now, still left to right. The target was partially obscured, visible from the shoulder up, moving slightly as he spoke into the radio. This was the shot that mattered. Take out the command element, and the attack would become uncoordinated. Every fighter still alive would be operating on their last received instruction rather than an adaptive response to what the Marines were doing. It wouldn't end the fight, but it would change its character completely. She settled. Her world went to that small, still place. One breath, held half expelled. The reticle, the calculation. Her finger on the trigger, the weight of the pull, the moment just before. A voice crackled in her earpiece. Sharp command tone. The voice of someone who had just figured out something that changed the geometry of the situation entirely. All elements, we have identified the western ridge. Overwatch. Exercise caution with fire direction. The command wants to know ghost element. Identify yourself. Identify yourself now. Maya's finger stayed on the trigger. The commander on the eastern ridge was still there. Still in the reticle, still alive. She had maybe 3 seconds before he moved again. The voice in her earpiece repeated, ghost element. Identify yourself. She breathed out. Crack. The eastern ridge went quiet. The echo of that last shot rolled across the pass and dissolved into the rock. Maya stayed flat. She didn't move for a full 30 seconds, just listened, watched, let her breathing come back to something manageable. Below her on the western shelf, what remained of the mortar crew had gone to ground. On the eastern ridge, the organized fire that had been tearing through the convoy minutes ago had fractured into something scattered, reactive, leaderless. She could hear the difference even through the ambient noise of the firefight. The rhythm had broken. Whatever the commander on that eastern ridge had been orchestrating, it was over. The convoy was still taking fire, but it was different fire, now individual shooters picking targets, not a coordinated machine. The Marines below were starting to push back. She could hear it in the radio traffic. The voices had changed quality. Still urgent, still sharp, but the panic had a shape to it now, instead of being formless. People were reporting positions. People were giving orders and getting answers back. She reloaded. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory, handling the mechanics while her eyes kept scanning. 41 rounds expended. She had done a quick count during the last reposition. She was burning through her load faster than she would have liked Swick. She had another 260 rounds in the pack. That was enough if she was disciplined about it. It was not enough if this turned into a sustained engagement. The radio crackled again. Ghost element. This is actual. You are ordered to identify. Now, she recognized the voice this time. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Hale. She had seen him twice at Redstone, a tall, rangy man from somewhere in the South who had the reputation of being precise to the point of inflexibility. He was the kind of officer who made good decisions in controlled environments and struggled slightly when the situation outran his planning assumptions. His planning assumptions were currently on fire at the bottom of Raven Pass. She keyed her radio. Working, she said. Then she released the transmit button and went back to scanning the eastern ridge. There was a pause on the net. She could almost hear the confusion. It took another 40 minutes to finish it. Not clean. Not the way it sounds when people describe these things afterward, with clear phases and decisive moments. It was ugly and incremental, full of decisions made on bad information, and corrected a second later when better information arrived, full of shots she was confident about and shots she wasn't. At one point, she nearly fired on a position that turned out to be a Marine who had gotten separated from his element and climbed 20 meters up the eastern ridge face on his own initiative. She saw the uniform at the last possible moment, the last quarter inch of trigger pull, and redirected. Her knee was screaming. She had stopped registering it around minute 15, or rather she had registered it and filed it in a place where it couldn't affect her work, which was different from not feeling it. She moved position 11 times in 40 minutes. The last 2 movements were harder than they should have been. She was getting tired in the specific way that long shooting sessions produced, a kind of fine motor degradation that showed up first in the precision of her breathing and then in the consistency of her grip. She compensated by slowing down, taking an extra second on each shot, trusting the fundamentals more and her instincts less. When the last organized enemy position went silent, she was lying behind a flat rock, about 30 meters from where she had started, looking out across a valley that had stopped exploding. The burning vehicles were still burning. The smoke was going almost straight up in the still morning air. Below she could see the Marines reorganizing, pulling casualties to covered positions, consolidating, establishing a perimeter. The radio traffic had shifted again from combat reporting to medevac, coordination, and accountability calls. All elements, this is actual. Consolidate on Alpha vehicle. Accountability in 10 mics. Medevac inbound, LZ, is 200 meters north of the lead vehicle. All senior NCOs report to me. She lay there and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that now that there was nothing to aim at a fine tremor through both hands that she couldn't stop, just had to wait through. Her mouth tasted like copper and dust. She had sweated through her uniform dust. She had sweated through her uniform completely, and the dry air was wicking the moisture away, fast enough that she could feel the salt crystallizing against her skin. She had fired 63 rounds. She had kept count without trying to. After a while, she sat up and drank half a water bottle in one go, which was more than she should have, and then made herself stop. The radio crackled. Ghost element. Last known position, Western Ridge. We need you to identify yourself and come in. She sat with it for a moment. Ghost 21, she said. Give me 30 minutes to get off this ridge. A pause. 30 minutes. Then I want you at the command vehicle. Copy. The climb down was worse than the climb up. Her knee made itself impossible to ignore once the adrenaline finished draining, which happened somewhere around the 3rd shelf from the bottom. In a sudden, comprehensive way that made her stop moving for about 20 seconds and just grip the rock and breathe. Then she kept going, because stopping wasn't a real option. She reached the valley floor and crossed the road, picking her way between vehicle wreckage and the debris field of a firefight, expended casings, blown equipment, pieces of things she didn't look at too closely. A group of Marines watched her come across the open ground. None of them said anything. She was a stranger moving through their disaster, and they were still processing. What had happened to them? The command vehicle was parked in a cut in the road where the valley widened slightly. Lieutenant Colonel Hale was standing beside it, talking to 2 officers she didn't recognize. He was older than she remembered. The last hour had done something to his face. Or maybe she was just seeing it differently now. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. Sergeant Torres, he said finally, like he was confirming something to himself. Sir, you were outside the wire. Yes, sir. Without authorization. Yes, sir. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at her rifle, at the pack, at the rangefinder still clipped to her kit. His expression was complicated in a way she didn't try to read. How many rounds? He said. 63 expended, sir. How many? She had kept count of confirmed drops and probable stops separately. 37 confirmed. Another 8 probable I couldn't verify. Something moved through his face. 45 at minimum, sir. He looked away from her across the valley. One of the officers beside him said something quietly. Hale shook his head once, a very small motion, and the officer went quiet. You're going to hand me your weapon and your ammunition, Hale said. You're going to ride back to Redstone in the rear vehicle, and you're going to stay in confinement until the Investigation determines what happens next." "Understood, sir." She handed over the rifle and the pack. He took them himself, didn't hand them off. "Torres." He said it when she was turning away. She stopped. "The RPG team. Second vehicle. If they'd gotten that second shot off." He stopped. Started again. The second vehicle was carrying the medevac personnel and equipment. All of it. She didn't say anything. "I'm not saying that to you for any tactical purpose," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true and you should know it." "Yes, sir," she said. She walked to the rear vehicle and got in. Through the window, she watched Hale turn back to his officers, the rifle she had been carrying now in his hands. He stood there holding it for a moment, like he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Then he set it carefully against the vehicle's side and went back to managing his disaster. Redstone received her like a body being returned. The duty officer at the gate clocked her return, logged her time, and called it up the chain without a word to her directly. By the time the vehicle reached the motor pool, there were 2 military police personnel waiting, young, professionally neutral in the way of people following clear instructions. They escorted her to a holding room in the administrative building, a small space with a table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out on the blast wall. She sat down. Someone brought her water and an MRE she didn't eat. She drank the water. Cole came by about 2 hours later. She heard his voice in the hallway, not the words, just the cadence, that particular rhythm of Cole talking about something he found satisfying. Then the door opened, and he stood in it, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully name. It was somewhere between vindicated and something else, something more conflicted, which she hadn't expected from him. "Hell of a morning, Torres," he said. She didn't answer. "They're going to throw the book at you." He leaned against the doorframe. "You know that, right? Leaving the wire without authorization, conducting offensive operations without orders, potentially compromising the command's situational awareness by creating an unknown shooter in the AO-. You can leave, Cole. I'm serious. Whatever happened out there. I said you can leave." He stood there for another moment. She kept her eyes on the blast wall through the window. After a while, she heard him push off the doorframe and walk away. The room was quiet again. She thought about Rourke's briefing. The pointer dancing on the map. Intel confirms the corridor is clear. She thought about the satellite images spread across her desk, the vehicle track disturbance 40 meters off the road, the shadow under the eastern overhang. She thought about all the ways she had tried to make herself heard. In the 6 weeks before this morning, the formal channels and the informal ones, the careful language she had used in the briefing room, because she knew that the second she seemed emotional or shrill, the argument was over. She thought about whether it had mattered. 480 Marines. The math was simple, and she'd do it anyway. Major Rourke came to see her that evening. He came alone, which surprised her. He sat down across from her at the table, which also surprised her. He didn't look the way she expected. She had braced for the official version of him, the composed authority figure. Instead, he looked like a man who had been awake too long and had spent the hours thinking about something he couldn't resolve. He set a folder on the table. "The preliminary count," he said, "is 4 killed in action and 11 wounded. They're still doing the full accountability." He paused. "Early projections. Before whatever happened on that ridge, the casualty estimate for a successful ambush in that terrain was between 60 and 90 KIA. Minimum." Maya said nothing. "I want to be clear that this is not an exoneration conversation," Rourke said. "You violated orders. You left the wire without authorization. Those facts don't change because of the outcome." "I understand, sir." "I also want to be clear." He stopped, set his hands flat on the table. "In the briefing, when you raised the terrain concern, I dismissed it. Yes, sir. I want to know if you had more to say, and I didn't give you room to say it." She looked at him for a moment. There was something real in the question. He wasn't asking to protect himself, she thought. He was asking because he actually wanted to know. "I had the sightline analysis," she said. The mortar positioning math. Probable enemy strength based on the track disturbance and the pattern of the aerial surveillance gaps. She kept her voice even. I also had 11 days of terrain study. I wasn't guessing. Where did you get the imagery? I requested it through the standard intel sharing protocol for logistics route planning. Nobody flagged it as unusual because route analysis is part of my job. You were doing route analysis. I was doing route analysis, she said. And when the analysis told me something I didn't want to find, I kept doing it to make sure I was right. Rourke sat with that. Torres, he said slowly, who taught you to shoot? The question came from somewhere she hadn't expected. My father, sir. He was Army, combat engineer, and the terrain analysis. Where does that come from? From reading terrain, sir. I've been doing it since I was a kid. My father used to take me out into the desert outside Tucson and ask me questions. What's on the other side of that ridge? Where would you hide if someone was looking for you? Where are your fields of fire? She paused. He said you could tell a lot about a place by spending time with it. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You applied for scout sniper training. Twice. I know. He opened the folder. She could see denial paperwork inside it. She recognized the header format. I saw your file when they did the initial review for the investigation. Your first application denied on operational grounds. Your second, he stopped. The second denial. I signed it. She held very still. It came through my desk at a time when I had 3 priority requests in the same week, and I didn't read it as carefully as I should have. He closed the folder. I saw logistics, and I made an assumption. The silence in the room had a particular quality. She could hear the ventilation system cycling somewhere in the ceiling. Sir, she said, what happens now? Formal investigation, UCMJ review. That process happens regardless of what I think about it. He stood up, gathered the folder. But I am going to submit a full account of what I witnessed today, including the terrain briefing and my response to it. He looked at her directly, and I'm going to be accurate. He left. She sat in the empty room and looked at the blast wall and tried to figure out what she felt. It wasn't relief. It wasn't vindication. It was something smaller and more complicated, the feeling of being seen, maybe, after a long time of the opposite. She wasn't sure if she trusted it yet. The investigation ran 11 days. It was conducted by a colonel named Claire Whitmore, the base commander. A woman who had the reputation of being methodical to the point of being slow and fair to the point of being occasionally inconvenient for people who preferred a quicker finding. Maya met with her twice. The first meeting was procedural. Timeline, authorization, chain of command, the specific orders she had violated. Whitmore asked questions and listened to the answers without reacting, which was either professional detachment or the sign of someone who had already made up her mind, and Maya couldn't tell which. The second meeting was different. Walk me through the terrain assessment, Whitmore said. From the beginning. Not the briefing, not the day of, from when you first started looking at it. So Maya did. She had kept her notes. They had returned her personal notebook with her other effects, and she went through them systematically. The initial satellite imagery request. The first anomaly she identified. The 11 days of analysis. The progressive refinement of her assessment. The mathematical modeling she had done on firing angles and mortar positioning. She had done most of it in a notebook by hand, because she didn't have access to the tactical planning software the intelligence section used. Whitmore studied the notebook for a long time, without speaking. You did this by hand, she said. I don't have the system access, ma'am. I requested it twice. Denied both times? Never formally denied. Just not actioned. Whitmore set the notebook down. In your assessment, if the convoy had been halted at the entry point to the pass and the ridgelines swept before the main element entered, how long would that have taken? If you had 2 sniper teams working the ridgelines, about 4 hours for a clean sweep. Maybe 3 if they moved fast. Maya paused. You probably would have found at least the mortar position on the western shelf. That alone would have triggered a route reassessment. 4 hours versus 45 friendly casualties. Yes, ma'am. Whitmore closed the notebook and handed it back to her. The investigation will conclude in approximately 72 hours. You should know that Major Rourke has submitted a full statement regarding the pre-mission briefing, including his own response to your terrain concerns. Yes, ma'am. You should also know that we have statements from 7 Marines in the convoy who reported observing the Overwatch fire from the western ridge and crediting it with disrupting the ambush command structure. At a critical moment, she looked at Maya steadily. They used the word decisive. Maya didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't sound like either false modesty or preening, so she said nothing and let it sit. One more question, Whitmore said. When you were on that ridge and you heard Lieutenant Colonel Hale asking you to identify, you kept shooting. Yes, ma'am. The command element on the eastern ridge was still active at that point. Yes, ma'am. He was still in the reticle. I had approximately 3 seconds before he would have moved to a position I couldn't reach from where I was sitting. She paused. I made a decision about priority of effort. You prioritized the shot over the order. Yes, ma'am. In the moment, yes. Whitmore looked at her for a long time. That's the part that's hardest to categorize. She said finally, not accusatory, just observing something true. I know, ma'am. The investigation concluded on a Tuesday morning. Maya was brought into Whitmore's office, which was larger than it needed to be, and decorated with the spare functionality of someone who had moved too many times to accumulate anything they couldn't pack in 2 bags. Whitmore sat behind her desk. Rourke was present, standing to one side. There was a 3rd officer Maya didn't know, a JG major who had been around Redstone for the past week, whose presence here confirmed what kind of meeting this was. Sergeant Torres, Whitmore began. The investigation has concluded that you willfully and without authorization departed the base perimeter, conducted independent offensive operation, AKINS, in an active AO without orders or command coordination, and created an unidentified shooter situation that had the potential to cause friendly fire incidents. She spoke with the flat precision of someone reading from a finding they had personally authored. These are violations of direct orders and military protocol. The investigation does not find grounds for dismissal, but a formal reprimand will be entered into your service record. Maya kept her eyes on the middle distance. A formal reprimand. That was the shape of it. In addition, Whitmore continued, the investigation has found that legitimate tactical concerns raised by Sergeant Torres prior to the mission were not given adequate consideration at the command level. The terrain analysis that Sergeant Torres conducted independently, using available open-source imagery, identified threats that the formal intelligence assessment had failed to account for. This failure is documented and is being addressed through separate command accountability processes. She paused. Major Rourke's forthcoming reassignment is part of that process. Maya didn't look at Rourke. She felt him in her peripheral vision, still and composed, accepting something. The formal reprimand is the disciplinary action, Whitmore said. That is the conclusion of the UCMJ process. And then she did something Maya hadn't expected. She folded her hands on the desk and shifted her register not from formal to informal exactly, but from procedural to something more direct. I want to be transparent about something that is separate from the disciplinary finding, Whitmore said. You are a logistics Marine with a standard rifle qualification on your service record and no formal advanced marksmanship training. In the course of this investigation, we reviewed the physical evidence from the Raven Pass engagement. 63 rounds expended, 45 confirmed and probable targets. Over 40 minutes of continuous overwatch from nearly a kilometer. She paused, and something shifted in the quality of the pause. Where did you develop that capability, Torres? The room was very quiet. Maya took a breath. It was the question she had known was coming eventually, not the official one, but this one. The real one. My father's range, ma'am, and 7 years of shooting on my own time whenever I could get access to a lane. She paused. I kept detailed practice logs. I can provide them. I've already seen them, Whitmore said. They were in your personnel file annex. Nobody had apparently reviewed them. She looked at Maya with the same steady, calibrating attention she had shown throughout the investigation. You have been trying to get into advanced training for 2 years. Yes, ma'am. The program at Fort Carson. The Scout Sniper Pipeline. Yes, ma'am. Twice. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. There is a third option on the table, she said. It requires your agreement, and it is not a guaranteed outcome. It's a transfer to the advanced sniper qualification. Program at Quantico, assigned as a lateral candidate from a non-standard track. It's been used before for candidates who demonstrated capability outside normal pathways. She let the sentence sit. The reprimand goes on your record. The transfer also goes on your record. What you do at Quantico is then up to you. Maya looked at her. Ma'am. Yes. She stopped. Started again. Is this instead of the reprimand or in addition to it? In addition, Whitmore said. I want to be clear. You violated orders. That stands. The record reflects what happened. The opportunity reflects what else happened. A pause. Both things can be true. Maya sat with that for a moment. Both things can be true. She had known that already, had known it from the moment she climbed off that ridge and started walking toward the command vehicle. She had broken the rules, and the rules had been worth breaking, and both of those things were permanently, uncomplicatedly real. I'll take the transfer, she said. Whitmore nodded once. Then we're done here. She stood. The JAG major quietly gathered his materials and left. Rourke followed, pausing at the door for a half second. Maya thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He just left. Whitmore walked to her window and looked out at the blast wall and the wedge of desert sky above it. She stood there for a moment with her back to Maya. For what it's worth, she said, and her voice had changed again. Even quieter now, I reviewed the full ambush plan, the document they recovered from the enemy command element. She paused. It was dated 3 weeks ago. They had been planning that ambush for 3 weeks, waiting for us to use that route. She paused again. They had accounted for everything. Extraction corridors, command dispersal, backup firing positions. She turned around, except for someone on the western ridge. Maya held her gaze. They didn't think we'd put anyone there. No, Whitmore said. They didn't. A beat, too. Dismissed, Sergeant. She cleaned out her space in the logistic coordination room on a Thursday afternoon. It didn't take long. She hadn't accumulated much in 7 months. Her notebooks, the printed satellite imagery she had studied for 11 days, a photograph she kept taped to the desk of her father, standing outside his workshop in Tucson, squinting into the sun with his arms crossed, and that particular expression he wore when he was trying not to look proud of something. Reyes appeared in the doorway while she was packing. He looked like he hadn't slept much in the past week and a half, which she imagined was accurate. Quantico, he said. Quantico. Sniper school. Program, she corrected him. It's a program. He came into the room and sat on the edge of the desk she was clearing, watching her pack. After a while, he said, when you left the wire, when you actually crossed through the gap and started running, were you scared? She thought about it honestly. Yes. Of getting shot? Of being wrong, she said. If I'd been wrong about the ambush, I would have just been a logistics sergeant who abandoned her post during a combat operation to go do things she wasn't authorized to do. She paused. That's a certain kind of story. But you weren't wrong. No. He nodded slowly. What if you had been? She folded the satellite imagery and set it in the box. I'd have come back and faced whatever came with it. She looked at him. I wasn't going to stop being right about Raven Pass just because it scared me to act on it. Reyes looked at the photograph of her father. He'd be pleased, he said. He'd tell me I took too long to decide, she said. He was always faster about things like that than I am. She picked up the box. It was lighter than she expected, which was either a comment on how little she owned or on how much she had just put down. She walked out of the logistics coordination room and down the corridor and out into the hard, flat light of Redstone. A vehicle was idling near the gate, waiting to take her to the airfield. In 24 hours, she would be at Quantico, walking into a program that didn't have a clear place for her, carrying a service record that said she was both disciplined and capable in the same breath. She loaded the box into the vehicle. Cole was standing near the motor pool, watching her. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. He had the look of someone who had revised something about the world and wasn't entirely comfortable with the revision. She got in the vehicle. The gate opened. Redstone fell away behind her. Quantico in November was cold in a way the desert never was, not the dramatic cold of somewhere with real winters, but a damp, penetrating cold that came off the Potomac and settled into everything, into your boots and your rifle and the back of your neck at 500 when the range lights were the only things cutting the dark. Maya had been there 9 days before anyone spoke to her directly about anything other than administrative processing. The Advanced Sniper Qualification Program, ASQP, which everyone called the program because nobody wanted to say the full name, twice ran out of a low concrete building set back from the main range complex. There were 14 candidates in the current class. 12 had come through standard pathways, Scout Sniper Qualified Marines with combat tours, specific MOUP-S designations, command endorsements with the right language in them. One was a Navy SEAL cross-training for inter-service qualification. And then there was Maya Torres, Logistics Marine, carrying a formal reprimand and a transfer authorization that still confused the administrative sergeant who had processed her paperwork. This says lateral candidate, the sergeant had said, frowning at his screen. Non-standard track. I don't think I've processed one of these before. I don't think many have come through, Maya said. What's your sniper qual level? I don't have one. He had looked up from the screen then, really looked at her. Ma'am, this is the advanced program. I know. He had looked back at the screen, then at her, then at the screen again. Then he had printed her paperwork without another word, because the authorization had come from a colonel's office, and he wasn't going to argue with the colonel's office over something he didn't understand. The program's primary instructor was a gunnery sergeant named Warren Tibbs, who had the build of a man who had once been larger and had compressed himself down through years of patience into something denser and quieter. He had 19 years in, 2 combat deployments as a sniper team leader, and the specific manner of a person who had learned a long time ago that most things people said were less interesting than what they did. He ran his introductory assessment on the third day individual shooting evaluations, terrain familiarity tests, a written exercise in range card construction. He came to Maya last. Torres. He said it without inflection. Non-standard track. Yes, Gunny. You understand this program assumes a qualified baseline. Yes, Gunny, and you don't have that baseline. Not formally. He looked at her in a way that wasn't hostile, but wasn't welcoming either. It was the look of a man who was categorizing information carefully. What do you have? Practice logs going back 7 years. Redstone range records. The after action from Raven Pass. She paused. And what I did on that ridge, whatever that's worth. He was quiet for a moment. Raven Pass came through the network before you got here. The numbers. Yes, Gunny. 63 rounds. 45 targets. 40 minutes. He said it the way he might say a weather report factual, neither impressed nor dismissive. Any team would be proud of those numbers. One person doing it solo, unknown terrain, unplanned engagement, no spotter. He stopped. That's either the most impressive shooting I've ever heard of, or you got very lucky with very poor enemy positioning, and you've mistaken luck for skill. I've asked myself the same question, she said. He looked at her. What did you decide? I decided I'd rather find out here than wonder about it. Something moved through his expression too brief to classify. He made a note on his clipboard. Gear check at 500. Don't be late. The other candidates made up their minds about her by the end of the first week. Not loudly. It wasn't that kind of environment. Tibbs ran a quiet program, low on theater, high on performance. But there were ways people communicated what they thought without using words, who you made room for at the range equipment table, whose shooting you watched and whose you turned away from, how you responded when someone asked a question in the group debrief. Maya had enough experience, being the person people had already categorized, to read the signals accurately. Sergeant First Class Donovan Cross was the most direct about it. He was from the SEAL pipeline, big, technically precise, with the competitive instinct of someone who had spent years in an environment where comparison was constant and expected. He came to her at the range after the first long-distance session, when she had put up numbers that were below the class average. She was shooting at 900 meters with equipment she wasn't fully calibrated to yet, and it had shown. "I heard about Raven Pass," he said. It wasn't a compliment. "Okay, what range were you shooting from?" "Varied. Closest was about 400. Farthest confirmed hit was just over 900. 900. He tilted his head slightly. "Today you were shooting at 950, and you were 2 feet high on 5 of 8 shots." "I know. That's a significant inconsistency." "Yes, it is," she said. She started breaking down her equipment. "Is there a question in here, or are you just cataloging?" He watched her work. "I'm trying to figure out what you actually are," he said. "Because the file says one thing, and today says something different." She looked at him. "What does today say?" "Today says you're a decent shooter who got lucky in a chaotic engagement and got sent here because someone at the top wanted to cover a PR problem with a feel-good story." She set down the barrel assembly she was cleaning. She kept her hands very still. Raven Pass was 11 days of terrain analysis, 12 kilometers of running, 40 minutes of consecutive shooting, with a knee that needed ice and rest, no spotter, no pre-planned firing positions, and a radio that kept telling me to stop. She kept her voice even. "If that's luck, I'd like to know what you call skill." "I call skill what I see at 900 meters on a stable day with proper equipment." "Then watch me tomorrow," she said. "With equipment I've had time to calibrate." She picked up the barrel assembly and kept cleaning. She shot better the next day. Not dramatically, not the kind of correction that made people stop and stare, but consistently better, with a tighter group and a corrected holdover at the extended range that brought her into the top half of the session scores. Tibbs watched her without comment. Cross watched her too, from across the line, and she didn't look back at him. The problem wasn't the shooting. The shooting she could figure out. She had always been able to figure out the shooting. It was mechanical, patient work, and patient mechanical work was something she understood. The problem was everything around the shooting. The team protocols, the communication standards, the specific vocabulary of a 2-person sniper element that she had never trained informally. A sniper team was not one shooter. It was a system, a spotter, and a shooter functioning as a single analytical unit with specific call procedures and target prioritization frameworks, and a communication rhythm that took hundreds of hours to develop. She didn't have those hours. In the first team exercise, she was paired with a Marine named Sergeant Aldous Kramer, second-year Scout Sniper Combat Tour in the Pacific, technically one of the 2 or 3 best shooters in the class. He was assigned the spotter role for the exercise, which meant he was running the optic, calling the wind and range, providing corrections, managing the target sequence. She was on the rifle. It went badly. Not catastrophically, she hit her targets, or most of them. But she and Kramer were not a unit. They were 2 people doing adjacent tasks in a shared space. He would call a correction, and she would apply it a half beat late because she was processing the format of the call instead of the content. She would ask for a range check at the wrong moment in the cycle, breaking his observation rhythm. Twice she anticipated a target call based on her own read of the field and was right but had moved before Kramer confirmed, which was tactically sound and procedurally incorrect, and she knew it as soon as she did it. Tibbs said nothing during the exercise. He said nothing in the immediate debrief either. He watched Kramer's score sheet, watched Maya's, wrote something on his clipboard. Cross shot a near-perfect session with his partner. He didn't look at Maya when the scores were posted. She ran the math that night in her bunk. The program was 12 weeks. Scoring was cumulative across individual shooting, team operations, written exercises, and field craft. She was competitive on individual shooting. She had gotten the calibration issue sorted by day 6, and her scores had moved into the top third of the class. Fieldcraft was natural to her. Reading terrain was the thing she had been doing since her father walked her across the Sonoran Desert and asked her questions until she stopped guessing and started seeing. Written exercises, she was fine. Team operations was the problem. It was worth 30% of the cumulative score. Right now, she was below the passing threshold on team operations, and the gap was not small. She could see 2 ways to close it. One was to ask for additional training time, more team exercises, more repetitions, more opportunity to build the rhythm she was missing. The other was to get faster on her own, to compress 7 years of informal solo work into 12 weeks of structured team learning. Neither option was comfortable. The first required her to ask for help in an environment that was already watching her for signs of inadequacy. The second required her to be wrong, repeatedly and visibly, in front of people who had already decided what she was. She got up at 4:30 the next morning and went to find Tibbs. He was already at the range house. She had expected that in 9 days she had not figured out when he slept, only that it was somewhere between midnight and 400, which suggested not much. He looked up when she came in, but didn't say anything. "I need more team reps," she said. "I know the protocol for requesting additional training time." "I know you know it. I'm requesting it." He set his coffee down. "Who taught you to spot?" "Nobody. You've never run a scope in a team context." "No. You've run solo. Always solo." He was quiet for a moment. "When you were on that ridge in Raven Pass, no spotter, no communication, no pre-planned sequence. How did you manage target priority?" She thought about it. "I kept a mental cue. Worked by threat priority active shooters first, then support weapons, then command elements. I was tracking maybe 8 targets at any one time and moving down the list." "In your head?" "Yes." "While shooting, yes." He picked his coffee back up. "That's not a skill problem, Torres. That's a translation problem. You have the analytical capacity. You don't have the language to run it through a partner." He looked at her. "The language is learnable. The capacity is rarer." She waited. "I'll give you 2 additional evening sessions per week," he said. "You'll run both role spotter and shooter alternating. I'll run the other position." He paused. "You're going to be slow and it's going to be frustrating." "I can handle slow and frustrating." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm saying yes." The additional sessions were exactly what he said they would be. Tibbs was a precise patient, an entirely unsentimental training partner. He called corrections in the standard format and expected her to process them at standard speed, which she couldn't do yet. So the early sessions were full of the small failures of a person trying to operate a system. They didn't speak fluently, the half-second delays, the confirmation requests at wrong moments, the occasional complete breakdown in communication, where she stopped the sequence soon to ask a clarifying question that she should have already known the answer to. He never expressed frustration. He also never softened anything. He would repeat a call once if she missed it, and if she missed it again, he would note the error and move on, because in real conditions there was no third repetition. She got better, slowly but measurably. By the 3rd week, she had the call formats internalized, and her processing time was approaching standard. By the 4th week, she was occasionally getting ahead of his calls in a way that was still slightly dangerous, anticipating rather than responding, but that he noted as a coaching issue rather than a fundamental problem. "You're predicting," he said, after a session. "I know." "Prediction gets people killed when you're wrong." "I know. I'm working on it." "Why do you do it?" She thought about the honest answer. Because I can usually see what's coming before it arrives, and waiting for the call feels slow when I already know. He looked at her for a moment. That's either going to make you exceptional or get your partner shot. I'm aware of both outcomes. Good, he said. Keep being aware. The class rotation brought her and Cross into the same team exercise on week 6. It was a joint assessment, 2 4-person teams running a combined field problem, which meant she was in Cross's operational environment, working adjacent to his element. The scenario was a 2-target engagement requiring coordinated timing. Both teams had to neutralize their assigned targets within a 5-second window to prevent a simulated hostile response. It required communication between teams, timing, coordination, and precision under a shared clock. Cross was running the spotter role for his team. His shooter was Kramer, who Maya had been paired with in the disastrous first exercise 6 weeks ago, and who she had since developed something approaching a functional working relationship with. The briefing was tense in the way that any environment is tense when people are competing and know it. Cross laid out his element's approach to the timing problem with the efficient confidence of someone who had done this before. Maya listened and said nothing, because his approach was tactically sound, and she didn't have a better one. Then Tibbs added a complication. Secondary target, he said. Added to the field problem at this time. Eastern sector, partial cover, 960 meters. Designated to Torres's element. It activates 30 seconds after the primary window. If it isn't neutralized within 15 seconds of activation, the problem fails. Everyone looked at the map. The secondary target was in a position that made the geometry extremely tight. It was partially obscured by a terrain feature, which meant the shooting angle required was acute and the margin for error was small. At 960 meters on a partial exposure, it was a difficult shot under normal conditions. At 960 meters after the team had already been running the primary engagement, with a 15-second window and the pressure of a failed problem behind it, it was something different. Cross looked at the map. He looked at Maya. He didn't say what he was thinking, but she had enough practice reading him by now. Torres' element handles the secondary. Tibbs confirmed. Cross's element coordinates primary timing. Let's move. They set up in 40 minutes, which was within standard. Kramer was spotting for her. They had developed enough of a rhythm over 6 weeks that the setup was clean. She trusted his range calls now, trusted his wind reads, had internalized enough of his call cadence that she could start processing while he was still delivering. The primary target window opened. She heard Cross's element engage 2 shots, tightly spaced, clean. Her element's primary went down simultaneously. The timing coordination had worked. 22 seconds of waiting. Her scope was already on the secondary position, which was a rocky cut in the hillside at 960 meters, with a target visible from the upper left quadrant of the opening only. The exposure was about 16 inches wide at that range. Wind was variable. She had been tracking it for 30 minutes, and it had shifted twice, from 6 knots right to left to 4 knots right to left and back, cycling roughly every 8 minutes. Wind, she said, 5 right to left, holding steady for the last 90 seconds. Copy. She settled her breathing, made the holdover adjustment mentally, checked it against her data, confirmed. The secondary target activated. Target, Kramer said. 960. Partial exposure, left edge. She was already there. The exposure was smaller than the briefing, had made it sound about 14 inches, maybe. The target was moving very slightly, the way targets in field problems always moved to simulate real conditions, a slow lateral shift that was going to take it out of the window in approximately 8 seconds. She had no more time to think about it. She fired. The round went where she had calculated it would go, which was where Kramer confirmed it went. Clean hit, partial exposure, 960 meters, 5 seconds, into the 15-second window. Silence. Tibbs' voice on the radio. Problem complete. All elements, consolidate. She lowered the rifle and lay there for a moment, her cheek still against the stock, looking at nothing. Kramer exhaled beside her a long, slow release. That was a real shot, he said. It was in the window, she said. Torres, that was a real shot. She sat up. Cross's element was consolidating 50 meters to her left. She could see him doing his post-exercise equipment check, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. He glanced at her. She couldn't read the expression from that distance, but he held it for a second longer than he needed to. Then he went back to his equipment. Week 8 brought the night exercise. This was where Maya had expected to struggle least, because the night exercise was fundamentally about patience and stillness and reading darkness, and patience she had in abundance. But the night problem Tibbs designed was not primarily about shooting. It was about infiltration. Two-person, element 7-kilometer movement through live monitored terrain, getting from a start point to a shooting position without triggering any of the 17 sensor emitters placed along the route. Sensor emitters that detected movement, heat, and sound within a 15-meter radius. The shooting position had to be reached before 300. If you triggered more than 2 emitters, you failed the exercise, regardless of your shooting performance. She was partnered with Kramer again. They studied the route for 3 hours before insertion. Maya spread the terrain map across the planning table and went through it the way her father had taught her, not looking at it as a map, but looking through it to the ground it represented, asking what the ground would feel like at night, where the natural corridors were, where the soil would be loose or firm, where the sight lines would compress, and where they would open. Kramer watched her. You move a lot slower through terrain analysis than you do through everything else, he said. It wasn't a criticism. He was genuinely observing. Because getting it wrong here costs more, she said. On the range, I can take a correction. Out there, I can't untrigger a sensor. Fair. He looked at the route she had been tracing. Why not the northern approach? It's shorter. The northern approach has a dry creek bed about 2 kilometers in. Creek beds collect cold air at night. Cold air sinks, sits low, holds thermal signature longer, because there's no convection to disperse it. We walk through that creek bed. We light up a heat sensor before we're halfway. He stared at the map. I wouldn't have caught that. You would have caught it when your boots hit the gravel, she said. That's the creek bed I grew up near. Different desert, same principle. They left the southern route marker at 2,115. It took 4 hours and 11 minutes. The terrain was harder than the map suggested it always was, and twice they had to pause and hold completely still for over 5 minutes, while a sensor emitter's detection radius drifted uncomfortably close to their position. The second pause was the harder one. They were in a shallow depression, prone, and Maya became aware after about 90 seconds that there was something under her left hand that was either a rock with an irregular surface or a piece of equipment from a previous exercise that someone hadn't cleared. It was pressing into the base of her palm in a way that was going to start being a real problem in about 2 more minutes. She didn't move. She breathed very slowly and counted and thought about something her father had told her once that discomfort was just information, and information was manageable. You could work with information. The thing that broke people was when they decided discomfort was a crisis instead. She held for 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Then the sensor window shifted and they moved. They reached the shooting position at 118. 42 minutes. Early. 0 emitter triggers. Tibbs was already there, which meant he had somehow moved through the same monitored terrain without triggering anything, which was either a different route or something she was going to spend a week trying to understand. He looked at his watch when they arrived, made a note. You took the southern route, he said. Yes, Gunny. Most elements take the northern. The creek bed, she said. He looked at her. How did you know? Desert nights. Thermal drainage in low terrain. She paused. My father. He was particular about creek beds. Tibbs made another note. He didn't say anything else, and in the particular economy of his expressions, she was trying to understand what that meant. The conversation happened on week 10 in the range house after the rest of the class had cleared out. She was cleaning equipment when Tibbs came in and sat on the bench across from her. She had learned by now that when he sat down unprompted, it meant he had decided to say something directly. Mid-program assessment, he said. Yes, Gunny. Individual shooting top 5 in class. Fieldcraft top 3. Written exercises top half. He paused. Team operations. I know. You've moved from below threshold to within passing range. The trajectory is good. He paused again. But you're not there yet. How many weeks do I have to close it? 2 assessment cycles. Weeks 11 and 12. He looked at her steadily. It's closable. I want you to understand that I'm not having this conversation to prepare you for a different outcome. I'm having it because you need to know exactly where the gap is and stop trying to close everything else instead. She had been doing that, she realized. She had been working on her individual scores because individual scores felt safe, felt measurable, felt like territory she controlled. Team operations were less controllable because they depended on her partner's state of mind as much as her own, and that dependency made her uncomfortable in a way she hadn't fully admitted. You trust your terrain, read more than you trust your partner, Tibbs said. She didn't deny it. That's not a personality flaw. It's an experience gap. You've spent 7 years making every decision alone because there was nobody else in the loop, and you got good at it. Now you're in a system that requires the loop. He looked at her. Kramer is a better spotter than you give him credit for. I know he is, do you? She thought about it honestly. I know it technically. I'm still operating like I'm the primary read and he's confirmation. Yes, Tibbs said. You are. He stood up. Fix that in the next 2 weeks. She nodded. He started to leave. At the door, he paused. Torres, the night infiltration exercise. Yes, Gunny. 42 minutes early. 0 triggers. He looked at her for a moment. The next best time was 11 minutes early, and 1 trigger. He paused. Nobody else caught the creek bed. Then he left. She sat in the emptied range house with the cleaned equipment in front of her and the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Outside, the Potomac cold was pressing against the windows. She had 2 weeks left. She had a gap to close, and she knew exactly what it would require. Trusting someone else's read when her own instinct was saying something different, which was the hardest kind of trust because it meant accepting that her instinct might be the problem. She had been operating like a single system her whole career. The gap wasn't in her capability. It was in what she had never had to learn to share. The week 11 team exercise came down to one moment. They were running a 3-target sequence, Kramer spotting, her shooting, 200-meter spread across the field with a 12-second window. Standard class exercise weighted heavily in the cumulative scoring. She had gone into it with a specific commitment. She was going to follow Kramer's calls, not check them, not run a parallel assessment in her head and use his call as confirmation. Follow them. 3rd target. Kramer called the range at 880 meters. Her own read from the MilDOT assessment she had done in setup was 904. 24 meters of difference. At that range, that was a holdover delta of approximately 4 inches. It mattered. Her instinct said, correct for 904. Kramer's call said 880. She shot at 880 meters. The round hit. Kramer's range call had been right. Her setup read had a parallax error she hadn't caught, a subtle equipment alignment issue that he had seen from the spotter position, and she hadn't seen from behind the rifle. She lowered the weapon and lay there for a second. She had been wrong. His call had been right. And she had followed his call because she had committed to following his call, which meant the outcome was correct, not by luck, but by the decision she had made before she knew which of them was right. She understood something then that she couldn't have understood before. That moment, trust in a team wasn't confidence that your partner was always right. It was a decision made in advance of knowing, held to under pressure, because the system only worked if both people were actually in it. She had been trying to be in two systems simultaneously, her own and the team's, and the team's had just saved her a miss. Good shot, Kramer said. Good call, she said, and she meant it completely. The final scoring session ran on a Friday. It was cold enough that morning to see breath on the range, a thin frost on the equipment cases that the early arriving candidates knocked off without remarking on. Maya was fourth in the rotation, which gave her time to watch the first three elements run their sequences and calibrate her expectations. Cross went second. He shot clean, not spectacularly, but with the solid, consistent precision of someone who had internalized every protocol so completely that emotion couldn't find a purchase in his process. She watched his split times between shots and noted they were essentially identical across the sequence. That kind of mechanical consistency was impressive in a way that was also its own limitation, but she kept that observation to herself. Kramer was waiting by the equipment bay when she came off the observation line. "You're thinking too much," he said. "I'm always thinking too much." Today specifically, he handed her her rifle case. "You've got the same look you had in week 2, like you're trying to solve a problem that isn't on the range." She took the case. "I'm fine. I know you're fine. I'm saying you look like you're not fine, which in a scored evaluation is the same problem." She looked at him. In 12 weeks, they had moved from two people doing adjacent tasks in a shared space to something that functioned like an actual team, which meant he now knew what her face looked like when she was managing something she hadn't told anyone about. It was a strange kind of exposure, being known that, specifically. "The reprimand is in my file," she said. "I know. Whatever I score today, whatever happens in the final assessment, it's in there permanently. Any posting, any command, anyone who pulls my record reads it first. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if that changes anything." Kramer was quiet for a moment. "Then, does it change what you can do on that range in the next 40 minutes? She thought about it. "No, then it doesn't change anything today." He shrugged, not dismissive, just practical. "The other stuff you figure out after." She picked up the rifle case. "Let's go." The final sequence was the most complex. The program had run a 6-target field problem across 3 ranges, with the targets appearing in a sequence that wasn't fully communicated until each prior target was resolved. It required real-time decision-making, continuous communication, and the ability to read sits between shots without carrying the previous shot's result, good or bad, into the next one. Maya shot the way she had learned to shoot over 12 weeks, trusting Kramer's calls, running her own red in parallel, but using it as a check rather than a primary, keeping the team loop functional even when her instinct was pushing her toward solo operation. She missed one shot. Target 4. The wind shifted between Kramer's call and her trigger. Break, a gust that neither of them had predicted, coming from a direction that the terrain shouldn't have produced, and that she suspected was a deliberate complication Tibbs had introduced, because the terrain didn't naturally funnel wind that way without some assistance. The round impacted 8 inches right. She called the miss herself before Kramer confirmed it, because she had felt it in the trigger pull, and she told him exactly what had happened, and they moved to target 5. That was it. 1 miss, 5 hits. The sequence time was within standard. She came off the range and broke down her equipment with her hands still slightly unsteady, not the adrenaline shaking of Raven Pass, but the fine motor aftermath of sustained, precise focus. Kramer scored the session sheet and handed it to the range safety officer without showing it to her first, which was correct procedure and which she appreciated. Tibbs ran the class debrief at 1,400. He went through each element's performance without editorial comment, just numbers, split times, error categories, the specific nature of each deviation from standard. When he got to her session, 5 of 6, one miss attributed to variable wind event, sequence time within standard. Communication protocols correct throughout. He paused after reading her numbers. Torres, he said. Gunny, the wind event on target 4. Your call or Kramer's? Neither. It wasn't in the data. It came from the northwest, which the terrain shouldn't support. And I fired on the last confirmed data, and it was wrong. I called the miss immediately and reset. He made a note. Good. He moved on. Cross was watching her from across the room. When she glanced at him, he looked away. The final program results were posted on Monday. Individual shooting, 2nd in class. Fieldcraft, 1st. Written exercises, 4th. Team operations, 3rd, which meant she had closed the gap from below threshold in week 1 to 3rd place in the final assessment. Combined cumulative score, 2nd overall, behind Cross, by a margin that was real but not large. She stood in front of the board for a moment and looked at the numbers. She had come in as a logistics marine with a reprimand and no formal qualification. She was leaving as the 2nd-ranked candidate in an advanced program. Both of those facts were permanently on her record. Both of them were true. Tibbs found her at the range house that afternoon, doing what she usually did when she needed to think cleaning equipment methodically, letting her hands handle the mechanics while her mind worked. Quantico certifies you as a qualified sniper team leader, he said. That goes on your record alongside the reprimand. I know. There will be commands that see the reprimand first and never read past it. I know that too. He sat down. It was the 2nd time in 12 weeks he had sat down across from her voluntarily, which meant something in his accounting. There's a posting, he said. It's an unusual one. Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport is building a new long-range precision element. They're looking for personnel with non-standard backgrounds, specifically people who can operate outside formal team structure when the situation requires it. He looked at her. The job description was written after Raven Pass. Not for you specifically, but the situation at Raven Pass is what made someone realize the capability gap existed. She looked at him. Someone at Bridgeport read the after action. Several people did. The numbers circulated. He paused. The commanding officer at Bridgeport is Colonel Whitmore. She went still. She requested your file 3 weeks ago, Tibbs said, before your final scores were posted. Maya sat with that. Whitmore, who had signed the formal reprimand. Whitmore, who had also signed the transfer authorization. Whitmore, who had stood at her window and told her about the enemy's ambush plan and the one thing they hadn't accounted for. Is this a formal offer? Maya asked. It's a posting option. It goes through standard channels, which means your scores and your record both factor in. But Whitmore has final say on her own personnel selections. He paused. I think you know what that means. She did. It meant Whitmore had already read the reprimand and the file and the after action and the program scores, and she had requested the file anyway. There's one more thing, Tibbs said. Cross put in for the same posting. She looked at him. He's qualified. He scored higher overall. He has a cleaner record. Tibbs said it without inflection. I'm telling you so you're not surprised. What does Whitmore know about his file? Everything she knows about yours. He stood. The decision is hers. The posting process takes about 3 weeks. He started toward the door. Torres. Gunny, 2nd in class, 1st in fieldcraft. He paused with his hand on the doorframe. The creek bed. You should write that down somewhere. It'll matter again. She flew back to Redstone on administrative orders, which was where her file would route through before any posting decision was finalized. It was not where she wanted to go, but the Corps moved paperwork on its own schedule, regardless of what individuals preferred, and returning to Redstone was the path the paperwork required. Base looked the same. Blast walls, concertina wire, the permanent diesel smell. She had been gone 14 weeks, and the desert looked exactly the way. The desert always looked indifferent, patient, older than anything happening on its surface. The duty office processed her return and told her to report to the operations building at 800 the following day. She found temporary billeting and dropped her gear and lay on the bunk for a while, looking at the ceiling. She thought about Cross. He was good. She had watched him operate for 12 weeks, and he was genuinely, seriously good. Clean technique, reliable under pressure, professional in the specific way of someone who had been trained in systems that worked and had never had reason to question them. The posting at Bridgeport would suit him, and he would perform well there. That was all true. It was also true that she wanted the posting. She had wanted it from the moment Tibbs described it, the way you want something that fits the exact shape of what you've been trying to do, build a capability from outside the standard pipeline, work in terrain that required reading rather than formula, operate in the space between what the plan accounted for and what the ground actually presented. She wanted it, and she had a reprimand on her record, and she was second behind a candidate with better paper credentials. And she was going to find out in 3 weeks which of those facts mattered most to the person making the decision. She slept badly and got up at 500 and ran 6 kilometers in the dark. The 800 meeting was with a captain she didn't know, an administrative officer, handling the post-program processing. Standard stuff, updated record entries, equipment accounting, reassignment pending. The captain was brisk and efficient and clearly had 6 of these meetings that morning. But as Maya was leaving, the captain said, "Oh, you have a meeting at 1000. Operations building, room 6. She checked her tablet. With Major Rourke. Maya stopped. "Rourke is still here?" "Reassigned to operations coordination. Administrative functions." The captain's tone was neutral, but the description communicated something. Rourke had come down from battalion-level planning to administrative functions, which was a specific kind of demotion that didn't require the word demotion to be used. "Thank you," Maya said. She walked to the operations building and found a chair in the corridor and sat with her thoughts for 90 minutes. Rourke looked older. Not dramatically. It had only been 14 weeks, but there was something different in how he occupied the room. The easy authority she remembered from the briefing, that unhurried certainty had been replaced by something more carefully maintained. He was still composed. He was working at it now in a way he hadn't been before. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. "I asked for this meeting," he said. "I want to be clear about that. It wasn't ordered." "Okay. How was Quantico?" "Good." He looked at her for a moment. "I heard about your scores." "Yes, sir. 2nd overall. 1st in fieldcraft." He paused. The Marine who ran the program, Tibbs, he submitted a supplemental assessment. Not standard practice. He did it on his own initiative. She hadn't known that. She kept her expression neutral. He described your fieldcraft performance as the best he had seen from a candidate in 9 years of running that program. Rourke said it without theatrical emphasis, just delivering information. He also noted the team operations gap in the early weeks, your trajectory in closing it, and the specific nature of how you closed it. He paused. He said you learned to trust a partner. He seemed to think that was notable. "It was hard," she said. "I spent a long time operating alone." I know. He opened the folder in front of him. She could see her own record inside it, the familiar header. "The posting at Bridgeport. You've heard about it." "Yes, sir. Cross has also applied." "I know." Rourke was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folder without looking at it, the way people look at something they're thinking about rather than reading. "I submitted a statement to Colonel Whitmore last week," he said. "About you, about the briefing, about the terrain assessment, about my response to it." He paused. "And about what the difference was between Cross's record and yours, from my perspective." She waited. Cross has never been in a situation that required him to be right when being right had personal cost, Rourke said. He's been right inside systems that rewarded his correctness. That's a kind of competence. It's not the same competence as being right. when the system is telling you you're wrong and the cost of acting on it is significant. He closed the folder. I said that in the statement. I don't know what Whitmore does with it. Maya looked at him. She was trying to figure out what this was, whether it was guilt management or something more genuine. She decided it was probably both, and that both could be true simultaneously without canceling each other out. "Sir," she said carefully, "why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to hear about it eventually when the posting process runs through channels, and I didn't want it to arrive without context." He paused. "And because I owe you at least one conversation where I'm being straight with you, without a rank differential doing the work of honesty." She sat with that. Outside the building, she could hear the distant sound of vehicle engines, a convoy staging, probably, the ordinary machinery of the base running on. "In the briefing," she said, "you knew what you were doing when you shut me down." "Yes. It wasn't just that you didn't agree with my assessment. You made a decision about what kind of source I was before you evaluated what I was saying." He didn't flinch from it. "Yes, that's accurate. And 45 casualties almost happened because of that decision." "4 happened," he said quietly. "4 did happen. The rest," he stopped. "The rest is the number we carry because of what you did on that ridge." "That's also accurate." The room was very still. "I'm not looking for an apology, sir," she said. "I know you're not." He looked at her. "I'm trying to figure out how to be a different kind of officer than I was the morning of that briefing. I don't know if I'm succeeding. But the statement I sent to Whitmore is part of that attempt." He paused. "For what it's worth." She stood. "It's worth something," she said. "I'm still deciding how much." She left. The posting decision came in 17 days, which was faster than the 3 weeks Tibbs had estimated. Maya was in the temporary billeting when the orders hit her queue. She read them twice because the first time she read them, she assumed she had misread something. Bridgeport, Mountain Warfare Training Center, Long Range Precision Element. Report date 22 days. She sat on the edge of the bunk with the tablet in her hands and looked at the orders. Cross found out the same day. She knew because the word moved through the base the way things did in small operational communities, fast, specific, delivered with the particular energy of people processing something unexpected. She heard about his reaction secondhand. He had been professional about it, which she respected. He had made no public comment. He came to find her that evening. She was at the range, not shooting, just sitting at one of the benches near the equipment bay, the same way she sat when she needed to think. He came across the gravel without trying to be quiet about it, which she took as a sign that he wasn't trying to catch her off guard. He sat on the bench across from her. He looked at the range for a moment. "Whitmore's decision," he said. "Yes. I read her statement. She released it through channels. It'll be part of the official posting record." He paused. She said, "You had a quality that was difficult to train and impossible to replicate through standard pipeline selection." She described it as, he stopped, seemed to be deciding whether to quote it directly. She said, "You could operate correctly in the absence of permission." Maya looked at the range. "That's a very specific thing to put in a posting authorization," Cross said. "Yes, it is. It's also true." He said it without apparent difficulty, which cost him something. She could see that it cost him something, the small tightness around his eyes. "I've watched you for 12 weeks. You operate outside the confirmation loop in a way I don't. I'm better than you at working inside established systems." "You are," she said. "But you're better at the moments when the established system hasn't caught up to the situation. Raven Pass was one situation. Raven Pass was the situation that almost didn't have a second act." He looked at her directly. "You made the right call when making the right call meant accepting personal destruction. I don't know if I would have done the same." She didn't have a comfortable response to that. So she said nothing. Cross stood. "I'll get the next posting," he said. It wasn't a consolation, it was an observation. He probably would. His record was clean, and his scores were excellent, and the Corps had many postings that suited exactly what he was. Bridgeport is the right place for what you do. He walked back across the gravel. She sat alone at the range bench in the cooling evening air and thought about what he had said. Operate correctly in the absence of permission. She had never thought of it as a skill. She had thought of it as a burden, the gap between what she saw and what she was authorized to act on, the constant friction of being right in a system that hadn't validated her rightness yet. She had carried it as weight for 7 years. She hadn't thought about what it looked like from the outside. She hadn't considered that it might be the thing worth keeping. She called her father that night. He was still in Tucson, still in the same house near the range, and he picked up on the third ring the way he always did, never the first, never after 5. She had asked him about it once, and he had said something about phones being for when people were ready, and that answering too fast suggested you'd been waiting, and he didn't believe in waiting for things that would come regardless. Quantico is done, she said. I heard. She hadn't told him the scores, but she had a feeling someone had somewhere along the chain of people who knew him and knew her, and moved information between worlds. Second in class. Second, you missed a shot. She almost laughed. How do you know about the missed shot? You mentioned Kramer had good calls. If you'd trusted his calls all session and shot clean, you would have said first. A pause. What did you miss on? Variable wind. Northwest gust in terrain that shouldn't have produced it. Tibbs put it there. Almost certainly. Good. She could hear him moving around the workshop, the familiar sounds of tools and metal, and the radio he kept on low in the background. How was the team piece? Hard, but you figured it out. Week 11, she said. I figured out I was running 2 systems simultaneously. Mine and the team's. She paused. I had to actually choose. And you chose the team. I chose the team. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set something down. That took longer for me too, he said. In the Army, I was good alone. Better than most people around me at the specific things that mattered in the field. It made me slower to trust, because trusting meant accepting I might be wrong on someone else's call. Were you? Wrong sometimes, less often than I expected. Another pause. Your grandfather used to say you could tell what a person was made of by what they did when being right was expensive. She heard the shift in his voice when he mentioned his father. It was a quiet register change, the sound of reaching back for something far away. I think about that more now than I did when he said it. She sat on the edge of the bunk with the phone against her ear and the desert dark outside the small window and the posting orders on the tablet beside her. Bridgeport, she said. Whitmore. Whitmore, she confirmed. Good. His voice was simple about it. Not effusive, he was not an effusive man, but she knew what that single word carried. He had known Colonel Whitmore's name since the investigation concluded, and he had formed an opinion about her that he kept to himself, except in moments like this one. You ready for it? She thought about Raven Pass. Amuaz. The 11 days of terrain study, the 12 kilometers of running, the 40 minutes on the ridge with a shaking hand and a blown knee. She thought about Quantico. The night infiltration, the creek bed, the week 11, shot at 880 meters when she had set down her own red and trusted Kramer's call, and been right to trust it. She thought about the gap that had been there since the beginning between what she could do and what the system had been willing to see. The gap was smaller now, not gone. It would probably never be entirely gone, but smaller. Ask me in about 6 months, she said. He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as he usually produced. That's the right answer, he said. She hung up. She lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling for a long time. 22 days to Bridgeport. 1 formal reprimand, 1 program qualification, 1 posting to a unit that had been built around a capability gap that a woman with a rifle and 11 days of satellite imagery had exposed in the most direct way possible. She had not arrived at any of it cleanly. She had arrived at it the way most things worth having were arrived at, through the specific, unglamorous work of being right more often than wrong, and surviving the times in between. Her knee still ached when the temperature dropped. It was going to be cold in Bridgeport. She thought she could live with that. 22 days moved the way time moved when you were waiting for something real slower than it should have, with the particular drag of days that were necessary but not yet the thing itself. She used the time well. She ran the terrain around Redstone every morning, pushing the knee carefully, building the load back up without making the same mistake she had made after Raven Pass, when she had ignored it too long and paid for it in the back half of the Quantico infiltration exercise. She read everything she could find about Mountain Warfare Training Center, its history, its training doctrine, the specific terrain challenges of the Sierra Nevada in winter, which was different from the Sonoran Desert in ways that mattered, and similar in ways that also mattered. She pulled topographic maps of the Bridgeport Valley and the mountains surrounding it, and studied them the way she studied all terrain, not as abstraction, but as ground, asking what it would feel like to move through it, where it would hide things, where it would expose them. She did not go back to the logistics coordination room. There was nothing there she needed. On the 19th day, Corporal Reyes found her at the motor pool. He had been assigned to a different section since her departure for Quantico, and she had not seen him, except at a distance. He looked the same, the easy smile that he used like a tool, the honest eyes underneath it. "Bridgeport," he said. "You heard?" Everybody heard. He fell into step beside her. Whitmore's unit. Whitmore's unit. He was quiet for a moment. They walked past the vehicle bays, past the fuel depot, into the flat open stretch near the western perimeter where the blast wall cast a long afternoon shadow. "I put in for sniper training," he said. She looked at him. "When?" 3 weeks ago. "First application." He shrugged, but it wasn't casual. She could see the work in it. "I figured if you could do it from logistics, I could try from logistics. It's not an easy program." "I know." He paused. "You going to tell me not to bother?" "No." She looked at him seriously. "I'm going to tell you to study the creek beds." He looked confused. Ask me someday. I'll explain it." She stopped walking. "Put everything in writing. Every terrain assessment, every observation that doesn't fit the official red. Every time you see something the briefing missed. Date it. Keep it." She held his gaze, "Not because you'll need it in court. Because it trains you to look at the ground instead of the map." He nodded slowly. "Is that what you did?" "That's what my father taught me to do." She paused. "It's not a trick. It's just attention. Most people stop paying attention when it stops being required of them." She started walking again. "Don't stop." He walked with her a while longer without speaking. When they reached the gate checkpoint, he stopped. "Torres." She turned. He looked like he was deciding whether to say the next thing. "After Raven Pass. When you were in confinement, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen. I kept thinking about the moment you left the wire." He paused. "What was the actual deciding thing? Not the tactical reason. The actual thing." She thought about it the way she always thought about that question, not trying to construct the answer, but locating it. "I looked at the convoy disappearing into the dust," she said, "and I thought about who was in it. Not as numbers, as people." She paused, and I realized the math was simple. Either I was wrong about the ambush and I'd face whatever came with leaving the wire, or I was right and I'd stayed put. She looked at the gate. "I couldn't live in the second version." He nodded. He didn't say anything else. She didn't need him to. Bridgeport was 3 hours northeast of Reno, tucked into a high desert valley at nearly 7,000 feet, surrounded on every side by mountains that meant business. The Sierra Nevada to the west held snow year-round above 11,000 feet. The ranges to the east were lower but sharper, fractured by the same geological violence that had made the whole basin and range country look like it had been dropped from a height and not quite reassembled. The town of Bridgeport itself was small in the way of western high desert towns. A few streets, a diner, a bar, a gas station, and the particular quality of silence that you only found where the elevation pushed most people away. The Mountain Warfare Training Center sat at the valley's northern end, a collection of functional structures with the look of a place that had been added to periodically without anyone worrying too much about whether the additions matched. The long-range precision element occupied the easternmost building 2 floors, a planning room, an equipment bay, and an attached range that faced a ridgeline about 800 meters away, with a series of ranges extending back to just under 2 kilometers. Maya arrived on a Tuesday in late January in a government vehicle. She had driven herself from the regional airport with her gear in the back and her Tucson Range notebook in the outer pocket of her kit bag, where she could reach it without unpacking. She sat in the parking area for a moment and looked at the building and the mountain behind it, which was white from about halfway up and had the kind of clean, cold, declarative quality of terrain that didn't care about anything happening at its base. She got out. Whitmore met her in the planning room. The colonel had not changed in the 4 months since the investigation, still the same contained, precise presence, still the same quality of attention that made you feel like every word you said was being processed rather than just heard. She was standing at the terrain table when Maya came in, looking at a topographic overlay of the Northern Range complex. She looked up. Torres. "Ma'am, good drive?" "Yes, ma'am." Whitmore gestured at the terrain table. "Come, look at this." Maya came to the table. The overlay showed a section of mountain terrain about 15 kilometers northeast of the base, a series of ridgelines, a narrow approach valley, a bowl-shaped depression at the head of it. She looked at it for a moment, the way she always looked at terrain. "What do you see?" Whitmore asked. It was the same question. The one Tibbs had asked, that Nork had never thought to ask, that her father had been asking her since she was 11 years old, standing at the edge of the Sonoran Desert, being asked to explain what was on the other side of the next ridge. She looked at the terrain. "The approach valley is a natural cold air drain," she said. At night, thermal exposure in the depression at the head will be high. You'll light up in infrared from the surrounding ridgelines. The western ridge has a false crest at approximately 200 meters elevation that looks like the dominant ground feature, but hasn't. The actual commanding position is behind it, another 40 meters up, which you'd miss if you were moving in low light and using the false crest as your reference. She paused. The depression itself is a problem. Enclosed terrain with only one natural egress. If you're inserting a team into that bowl, you need a secondary extraction route before you go in, because the terrain won't give you one after. Whitmore was quiet for a moment. The false crest. The shadow profile on the overlay. The way the contour lines compress and then separate, there's a shelf behind the apparent summit that the shading obscures unless you're looking for it. She looked up. "Has a team gone into that terrain?" "Not yet. We're planning an insertion exercise in 3 weeks. Whitmore looked at the overlay with a different quality of attention. Nobody on staff flagged the false crest. It's subtle. You'd see it on the ground. But not in time. Probably not. Whitmore straightened up. She looked at Maya with the same calibrating attention she had shown throughout the Redstone investigation. "You've been here 11 minutes, she said. "Yes, ma'am. And you found the problem my planning staff missed." Maya didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like either apology or arrogance. "That's why you're here, Torres," Whitmore said, simply. Then she turned to the door. "I'll have your element leader show you the rest of the facility. Brief on the range complex at 700 tomorrow." She left. Maya stood at the terrain table and looked at the false crest on the overlay and thought that this was how it would probably always go. Not a clean beginning, not a moment of formal arrival, just the work presenting itself before she'd had time to unpack. She was fine with that. The long-range precision element had 6 personnel when she arrived, 3 sniper team pairs, all of them qualified through standard pipelines, all of them with at least 1 combat deployment. They received her with the professional neutrality of people who had been told a lateral candidate was coming and had formed opinions about that before she walked through the door. The opinions were not uniformly negative. She could see the range in how people held their expressions, from genuinely open to carefully reserved, to one instance of something that looked like mild contempt, which belonged to a staff sergeant named Obi Ferris, who had the particular manner of someone who had worked very hard through proper channels and didn't appreciate the suggestion that there were other ways to arrive. She didn't try to manage any of it. She had learned at Redstone and then confirmed at Quantico that the only response to a room full of established opinions was performance. Not aggressive performance, not demonstrative performance, just the steady, consistent, unglamorous kind that eventually changed the accounting. She was assigned as team leader for the Element's C pair, partnered initially with a sergeant named Luz Camacho, second tour, qualified at the Scout Sniper Basic course. Quiet in the specific way of people who processed internally and produced conclusions rather than commentary. Camacho had the best natural fieldcraft in the element. Maya learned this in the first week, not from anyone telling her, but from watching Camacho move through terrain during the planning exercises. The way she navigated ground like she was reading it in real time, rather than following a route card. "You don't use the route card," Maya said, after the first joint planning session. Camacho looked at her. "The route card is for if I get lost." Which doesn't happen. Rarely. A pause. "Does that bother you?" "No. I do the same thing." Maya looked at the route plan on the table. "I just want to know how you read the approach valley in the northern complex." Camacho looked at the table. Then she looked at Maya. "You saw something. False crest on the western ridge. The actual commanding position is behind it." Camacho was quiet for a moment. "I thought the shadow profile looked wrong," she said slowly. "I didn't take it further. There's a shelf. You'd see it if you went up." Maya paused. "Worth an observation pass before we insert?" "Yes." Camacho looked at her with an expression that was reassessing something. "Definitely yes." Ferris was the harder case. He was technically excellent. She could see that clearly within the first 2 weeks. Clean shooter, solid protocols, no wasted movement. He had done everything the right way, and he had been good at it. His issue with Maya was not personal, exactly. It was structural. He had come through a system he believed in, and her presence represented an implicit argument that the system had limitations he wasn't ready to accept. He didn't confront her directly. He was too professional for that. But there were moments the way he framed debrief commentary, the specific questions he asked in planning sessions that were technically about the tactical problem, and were also about what kind of thing she actually was, where the subtext was clear enough that she didn't need to work to read it. The argument resolved itself, as these arguments usually did, on the range. The element ran a full 2-kilometer engagement exercise in the 4th week maximum range for the facility, low light conditions, variable wind, targets that moved. It was the most demanding exercise on the training calendar. And Whitmore ran it herself, which the element took as a signal that the results would go somewhere meaningful. Maya shot from C-pair's primary position, with Camacho spotting. The wind at 2 kilometers was difficult, not impossible, but the kind of difficult where you had to commit to a calculation and trust it completely, because the round was in the air for over 2 seconds, and any second guessing after trigger break was just like anxiety with nowhere productive to go. She shot 4 of 5. The miss was on the 4th target, a moving one, and the wind had shifted between Camacho's last call and her trigger break, the same class of problem she had encountered in the Quantico final. She called the miss immediately, absorbed it, moved to target 5. The element's combined scores went up on the board in the debrief. She was second in the element on the 2-kilometer engagement behind Ferris, who had shot 5 of 5 with a tighter group, which she thought was genuinely excellent work, and said so in the debrief without qualification. He looked at her when she said it. The look was brief and complicated. After the debrief, when the rest of the element had cleared out, he stayed. She was breaking down equipment. He came to the bench across from her and stood there for a moment. "Your read on the wind," he said. "On the fourth target. You called the shift after the fact." "Yes. You knew before you fired." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "I had a read that suggested it was shifting. I wasn't certain. But you felt it. I felt something. It wasn't confirmed." He was quiet for a moment. "I had the same feel on my third shot," he said. "I adjusted. It was the right call." He paused. "How did you decide to go with Camacho's last call instead of your own read?" "Because I made a decision 12 weeks ago to trust my spotter when the reads diverge and I don't have confirmation." She paused. "I've been wrong about that decision exactly once. I've been right about it 7 times. The ratio supports the decision even when it doesn't produce the shot." Ferris looked at the board where the scores still showed. He looked at his own numbers, 5 of 5, tightest group. He looked at her 4 of 5. "You're going to outshoot me eventually," he said. "Not hostile. Just assessing something. I might not. You're very good." "You will." He picked up his equipment case. "The false crest thing. On the northern approach." "Yes. I've been planning insertions into that terrain for 8 months, and I didn't see it." He stopped at the door. "How long did it take you to see it?" 11 minutes, she said. He nodded once. Then he left. It was not an apology, and it was not an endorsement, but it was the beginning of a different kind of accounting, and she recognized the beginning of a different kind of accounting when she saw it. Whitmore called her in at the end of the 2nd month. The colonel's office was spare in the way of someone who had moved many times a desk, a chair, a single-framed photograph of a mountain range that Maya didn't recognize. Whitmore sat across from her and opened a folder. 6-month review is early, Maya said. It's not a review. Whitmore looked at her steadily. The element is running a real-world tasking in 9 days. I want to tell you about it directly, rather than through the standard brief. Maya waited. There's a training compound in the high desert northeast of here, not military, not government. A private organization that has been using remote terrain for operational preparation. We don't know their full capability. We know enough to need current intelligence on their positioning and strength. Whitmore paused. It's an observation mission. 2-person element, 72 hours in the field, no action authority. You go in, you watch, you document, you come out. See pair, Maya said. See pair, you and Camacho. Why us specifically? Whitmore looked at her for a moment. The terrain is complex. The approach requires reading ground that isn't mapped accurately. The available survey data is 15 years old, and the landscape has changed. She paused. And I need someone who can make the right call if the situation changes in a way the orders don't account for. Maya sat with that. Operate correctly in the absence of permission. Cross's voice in her head, quoting Whitmore's own words, back in a Quantico parking area. What's the probability the situation changes? She asked. Unknown. That's the nature of the problem. Whitmore held her gaze. I'm not sending you in expecting a deviation. I'm sending you in knowing that if a deviation occurs, I need the right person making the judgment. And if I judge wrong, then we deal with what comes from that. Whitmore paused, the same ways we dealt with Raven Pass. There are consequences for wrong judgment and consequences for no judgment, and I'd rather have someone out there who understands both and acts anyway. Maya looked at the mountain photograph on the wall. She didn't know the range. She was going to ask about it. Later. When does Camacho get the brief? She said. This afternoon. I wanted to talk to you first. Whitmore closed the folder. Questions? The approach terrain. Can I get whatever survey data exists, even if it's outdated? Already in your queue. Satellite imagery of the last 6 months? Also in your queue, and the surrounding ridgelines. I want the elevation profiles out to 3 kilometers. Torres. Whitmore's voice had something in it that was almost amusement. It's already in your queue. 9 days was enough time. She and Camacho spent most of it at the terrain table, working through the outdated survey data and the satellite imagery together, building a picture of what the ground actually looked like versus what the maps said it looked like. It was the kind of work Maya had been doing informally for years, reconciling the abstraction with the reality, but doing it with Camacho, who had her own strong terrain sense and asked different questions than Maya did. Produced something better than either of them would have built alone. This section, Camacho said on the third day, pointing at a drainage feature northeast of the compound. The imagery shows standing water here in the October Pass. That means the soil is clay heavy, under about 40 centimeters. We move through there at night. We're going to leave print. We go around. It adds half a kilometer or a compromise trail. Maya looked at the imagery. We go around. Camacho nodded. She made the route adjustment without argument. This was the thing Maya had come to appreciate most about working with her. Camacho had strong opinions, and she held them until they were countered by better information, at which point she let them go cleanly. No ego residue, just the updated red. Ferris came by the planning room on the 6th day, which surprised her. He looked at the terrain table with the expression of someone who had decided to say something and was working up to it. Northern approach, he said finally. You're going around the drainage. Clay soil, we'd leave sign. He studied the route for a moment. The eastern ridge at this point, he touched the map, has an overhang. It'll look exposed from satellite, but it's shaded from the compound sight lines until you're within about 200 meters. He paused. I ran an observation exercise through that terrain 8 months ago, before the survey data was obviously wrong. A beat. The overhang is real. It'll give you better approach cover than the route you're running. Maya looked at the section he was pointing to. She had marked it as exposed based on the satellite imagery and moved the route south to compensate. She had not known about the overhang because she had not been in that terrain. He had. She looked at him. You're sure about the shading? I sat under that overhang for 4 hours. He met her gaze. I'm sure. She looked at Camacho. Camacho was already studying the adjusted route, running her own assessment. It works, Camacho said. Better than what we had. Maya made the adjustment. She looked at Ferris. Thank you. He shrugged small, practiced. Better brief than bad field, he said, and walked out. She looked at Camacho, who was almost smiling. Don't, Maya said. I didn't say anything. You were thinking something. I was thinking, Camacho said, that the element is starting to work like an element. She went back to the terrain table. I think that's probably good. They inserted on a Thursday night at 2,200 from a drop point 12 kilometers from the compound. The terrain was everything the outdated survey data hadn't adequately communicated, steeper, rougher, the quality of loose surface rock that made silence a continuous negotiation rather than a state you could achieve and maintain. They moved at the pace the ground allowed, which was slower than either of them wanted, and they communicated in either of them wanted, and the specific visual shorthand that 12 weeks of Quantico and 2 months of Bridgeport had built between them. The overhang was exactly where Ferris had said it would be. She paused under it for a moment, partly to assess, and partly because she had learned to acknowledge when someone else's knowledge had made the mission possible. The shading was exactly as described, deep enough to break their profile from the compound's elevated observations, is close enough to the final approach that they could hold here and observe before the last movement. They held for 40 minutes, watching, cataloging. The compound's activity pattern, the movement of personnel, the positioning of vehicles, sight lines from the elevated features around the perimeter. Maya had her notebook. She wrote in the dark, without looking at the page, the way her father had taught her. You learn the shapes of your letters well enough that you can produce them without sight, because the field doesn't always give you light. Camacho was in her scope, feeding observations in a low murmur. Maya wrote what she heard. Nothing happened that required a deviation from orders. The mission ran exactly as it was supposed to run, two people in the dark, watching, documenting, leaving no trace. They were out before dawn, back at the base by 930, in debrief with Whitmore by 1100. The debrief was thorough. Maya walked through the documentation, compound layout, personnel count and pattern, vehicle positioning, a flagged discrepancy between the expected access road and an additional vehicle track that didn't appear in any available intelligence, and that she had photographed from 3 angles before leaving. The vehicle track, Whitmore said, recent. The soil disturbance pattern suggests within the last 2 weeks. It runs northeast, which means it exits on a different axis than the primary axis. Maya put the photographs on the table. I don't know what that means. I'm flagging it because it doesn't fit the picture we had going in. Whitmore looked at the photographs for a long time. Good flag, she said. Then quietly, good mission. Afterward, sitting in the equipment bay with Camacho while they broke down and cleaned what they had carried for 72 hours, Maya felt something she hadn't felt in a long time and almost didn't recognize when it arrived. A simple, uncomplicated sense of having been exactly where she was supposed to be. Not vindicated, not proven, not the exhausted relief of Raven Pass or the careful satisfaction of Quantico scores. Just the feeling of alignment between what she was capable of and what was being asked of her, which was rarer than most people understood and more important than most people said. Camacho was cleaning her optic. She looked up. You going to do this for a while? Do what? This. Camacho gestured vaguely at the equipment, the building, the mountains visible through the bay door. Bridgeport. This element. Maya thought about it. Yes, she said. For a while. Good. Camacho went back to her optic. You're better at this than you think you are. I know what I am. I don't mean the shooting. Camacho set the optic down and looked at her directly. I mean the other thing. The reading. The creek beds and the clay soil and the false crests. She paused. Most people see what they're told to look for. You see what's actually there. She picked the optic back up. That matters more than the shooting. In the long run, Maya sat with that. She thought about her father standing at the edge of the Sonoran desert in the early morning light, asking her questions she hadn't yet learned how to answer. What's on the other side of that ridge? Where would you hide if someone was looking for you? Where are your fields of fire? She had spent 20 years learning to answer those questions, first in the desert outside Tucson, then in logistics rooms with satellite imagery spread across borrowed desk space, then on ridgelines and in ranges and on 72-hour missions through terrain that didn't care about the survey data. She thought about the 480 Marines. She did not think about them the way she had in the first weeks after Raven Pass with the raw, comprehensive weight of it. She thought about them the way you thought about something that had permanently changed the shape of your life without ceasing to be what it was. 4 people who had not come back, 476, who had the math that she carried because someone had to carry it. She thought about Okafor, 19 years old. His brother had gone first. She had checked quietly through the accountability records after the investigation. Okafor had made it out. He was in Pensacola now, on recovery leave for a leg wound that the casualty report described as non-critical. She had not contacted him. She had thought about it and decided it would be a strange intrusion, a stranger appearing in his life to say she had been watching from a ridge when things went wrong. She didn't need him to know. She just needed to know that he was somewhere in Pensacola, recovered, alive. That was enough. Whitmore found her at the range on a Friday afternoon, 6 weeks into her time at Bridgeport. Not the observation range, the far range, the 2-kilometer one, which Maya used on her own time when the element's scheduled hours were done. She was shooting at a steel target at 1,800 meters, working a problem she had been thinking about since the Quantico final, the interaction of thermal layering and bullet drift in high-altitude desert conditions, which behaved differently than the literature suggested, because the literature had mostly been written for sea-level environments. She heard Whitmore come up behind her and kept shooting, because interrupting a shot for a conversation you could have after was something her father had specifically told her never to do. Whitmore stood and waited, which told her the colonel understood that principle. She fired twice more, marked the results in her notebook, and sat up. Whitmore sat down beside her on the shooting mat. "I'm putting together a proposal," Whitmore said, "for a lateral candidate pathway into the precision element pipeline. Formal, with assessment criteria and command endorsement." She paused. "Based on the existing precedent. The existing precedent is me. The existing precedent is you," Whitmore confirmed. "And the argument is that the capability you represent doesn't get recruited by the standard pathway, because the standard pathway isn't looking for it." She looked out at the 2-kilometer target and said, "There are other Torres out there, in logistics sections, in support roles, in postings where nobody has thought to ask what else they can do." She paused. "I want a process that finds them before Raven Pass does." Maya was quiet for a moment. She looked at the steel target at 1,800 meters, a small rectangle of orange-painted metal that she could hit reliably now in variable conditions, which was a fact she had accumulated through 7 years of private work and 12 weeks of formal training and 6 weeks in a place that had finally given the work somewhere to go. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A written account of your trajectory. From the beginning Tucson, the applications, the terrain analysis process, Raven Pass, Quantico, here." Whitmore looked at her. "Not a formal report, a real account. The way it actually happened, including the parts that weren't clean." "Nothing about my trajectory was clean. That's the point," Whitmore said. "Clean trajectories don't teach anything. Yours teaches the specific thing we need to teach." She paused. "You had the capability for years before anyone gave you the framework to use it. How much time did we lose in that gap?" Maya thought about it. 7 years. The applications that went nowhere. The desk with the satellite imagery spread across it, and no system access to do it properly. The briefing room where she had said everything she needed to say and been told to sit down. "A lot," she said. "A lot," Whitmore agreed. "That's what the proposal is about." She looked at the target again. 1,800 meters. She thought about the first time she had asked her father what was on the other side of the next ridge, and the way he had looked at her, not at the ridge, but at her, like the question itself was more interesting than any answer she could give. She thought about everything it had taken to get from that ridge outside Tucson to this mat in Bridgeport, at 1,800 meters in the cold mountain and air, being asked to help build a door that hadn't existed when she had needed it. "I'll write it," she said. Whitmore nodded. She stood, brushed the dust off her uniform, and looked at the notebook in Maya's hand. "Start with the creek beds," she said. Then she left. Maya sat alone on the mat in the fading afternoon light. The mountains around the valley were going gold, and then red the way high desert mountains did at this hour, not gradual, but sudden, the color landing all at once like a decision. She opened the notebook to a blank page. She wrote the date. She wrote the place. She wrote, "My father used to say, you could tell a lot about a place by spending time with it. He was teaching me terrain. He was also teaching me something else, and it took me a long time to understand that the two lessons were the same lesson." She kept writing. The mountains went from red to purple to the deep, specific dark of high altitude, and she kept writing. And the cold came down off the peaks and settled into the valley, and she wrote through that too, because the cold was just information, and she had always known how to work with information. 45 Marines had not come home from Raven Pass. Not the 45 she had pulled from the ridgeline, the 4 who had died before she fired her first shot, and the 1 who had died of wounds 3 days later, despite everything. She carried their names in the back of her notebook, written small, without decoration. She had never shown anyone. She had never needed to explain it to herself. You carry what you carry because it deserves to be carried. Not as punishment, not as credential. Just because some weight is the right weight and setting it down would be a different kind of wrong. She turned to a fresh page. She started the account from the beginning. The ones who see what others miss are not always the ones who shout the loudest. Most of the time, they are sitting in the back of the room with a notebook, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The cost of not listening is measured in the most permanent currency there is. The question worth asking in any room, in any system, in any moment, when someone quieter than expected raises their hand, is not whether this person has the right credentials. It is whether they can see the creek bed.